The radar screen flickered twice before the signal appeared, and Commander Laura Bennett nearly dropped her coffee mug as she watched the identification code scroll across her monitor. She'd been working the night shift on the Earth-orbiting defense station for 3 years and had seen plenty of strange readings, but none like this. The code belonged to a ship declared lost 17 years ago, and every person who served on it was mourned and buried in empty graves on 3 continents. Laura's hands trembled as she reached for the communications panel, and within minutes, the entire command center was awake and buzzing with activity. Admiral Cole Patterson arrived, still putting on his uniform jacket, and his weathered face paled when Laura showed him the data. The horizon's edge was coming home, and that was supposed to be impossible. The ship had been humanity's greatest achievement when it launched so many years ago. 200 of Earth's finest crew members volunteered to travel beyond the Kuiper Belt and explore the uncharted regions of space where no human vessel had ever ventured. Captain Nathan Cross led them with confidence and courage, and the entire world watched with pride as the horizon faded into the darkness among the stars. 3 months later, all contact was lost, and despite years of searching, no trace of the craft was ever found. Now it was back. Laura watched through the observation window as the craft emerged from space, folded up, just beyond the moon. Even from that distance, she noticed something was terribly wrong. The hull was covered in strange patterns that seemed to change direction when she looked directly at them. Crystalline growth spread across the ship's surface like some kind of geometric infection, pulsating with a faint blue light that made her stomach churn. This wasn't the same ship that had left Earth 17 years ago. Admiral Patterson ordered a quarantine fleet to intercept it, and Laura volunteered to join the boarding party. She needed to see it with her own eyes. She needed to understand what had happened to those 200 people who had trusted her government to bring them home safely. The shuttle ride to the horizon was the longest 30 minutes of Laura's life. No one spoke. The soldiers around her checked their weapons again and again, and the scientists clung to their scanners like children clutching stuffed animals for comfort. When they finally docked at the largest ship, the airlock emitted noises that metal shouldn't make, and the air passing through it smelled of ozone and something else Laura couldn't identify. The ship's interior was riddled with flaws that were unbearable to look at. The corridors curved at angles that seemed to shift depending on where Laura stood. The rooms seemed larger on the inside than they should have been based on the ship's external measurements. The walls were covered with the same crystalline growths that marked the hull, and they hummed at a frequency Laura could feel in her teeth. They found survivors in the main control room. 37 people sat silently among consoles that had transformed into something barely recognizable as human technology. Most looked thin and tormented, but otherwise healthy. What struck Laura were their eyes. They all had the same distant expression, as if they were seeing something beyond the room, beyond the ship, and beyond anything she could comprehend. Captain Nathan Cross stood as the boarding party entered. He looked exactly the same as he had in the photos from the mission 17 years earlier. Not a single gray hair, not a single new wrinkle. Time had simply stopped for him while the rest of the world aged. Laura stepped forward and introduced herself. She asked what had happened to them and where they had been all these years. He stared at her for a long moment before answering. They had found something out there, she said. Something ancient and powerful, completely incomprehensible to humanity. Her voice had a force that made the armed soldiers behind Laura take a step back. That something had reached them and pulled them through a rift in reality itself. They had spent what felt like 3 years in a place where the rules of physics were mere suggestions. They had encountered beings that existed before the birth of the first stars, and these beings had bestowed gifts upon them. Laura asked what kind of gifts they were, and pointed with a cross at one of her crew members. A woman named Grace Sullivan stepped forward and placed her hand against the metal wall of the ship. The steel flowed like water beneath her palm and transformed into a perfect rose sculpture with delicate petals and tiny thorns. Grace withdrew her hand, and the rose remained solid, permanent, and utterly impossible. There was more, Cross said, many more weapons that could unravel reality itself, knowledge that could transform the galaxy, power that no civilization should ever possess. The beings beyond the rift had insisted that humanity accept these gifts because they said it would need them. Something was coming, and Earth had to be prepared. Laura felt cold despite the warmth of her environmental suit. She asked Cross if he and his crew were still human. She asked if she could trust them. Cross smiled sadly. He said they were still human in every sense, They still loved, feared, and hoped like everyone else. They still remembered their families, their homes, and their dreams. They were simply now more aware, more capable, more connected to the fundamental nature of existence. He said they hadn't asked for any of this. They had simply been explorers in search of new horizons. The universe had other plans for them. Now they had returned home burdened with responsibilities they had never imagined and knowledge they could barely contain. Laura surveyed the transformed ship and the transformed crew and made a decision. She would not treat them as threats or prisoners. She would treat them as what they were, survivors. Heroes, human beings who had endured the unimaginable and somehow found their way back home. He told Cross that Earth had changed in his absence. New alliances had formed. New enemies had emerged. The galaxy was a more dangerous place than ever. If his crew truly possessed the power he described, then they were poised to become the most important people in human history. Cross nodded slowly. He said he knew it. She said that was exactly what the beings beyond the realm had predicted. The universe was about to test humanity, and her crew had to help it pass that test. Laura took a deep breath and activated her communication device. She told Admiral Patterson that the horizon had returned and that everything was about to change. She didn't know if that change would be for better or for worse. All he knew was that humanity would never be the same. The information center beneath Geneva had been built to withstand nuclear attacks, but the people gathered in its deepest chamber felt exposed and vulnerable as they listened to the Horizon survivors describe their journey. World leaders sat alongside military commanders and scientific experts, all wearing the same expression of disbelief mixed with growing terror. Lieutenant Commander Amy Porter spoke first. She had been the ship's science officer before everything changed, and she still retained enough of herself to explain things in terms understandable to ordinary humans. She described how the edge of the horizon had detected an unusual energy signal 3 months into the mission. The signal led them to a region of space where reality itself seemed thin and worn, like old fabric about to tear. The tearing happened suddenly. One moment they were studying the anomaly from a safe distance, and the next something pierced through them and pulled them into a realm that defied every law of physics they had ever learned. Amy struggled to find words to describe what they experienced on the other side. Colors that didn't exist in normal space. Sounds that went unnoticed by the ears and spoke directly to the mind. Time flowed in directions meaningless to beings who had only ever experienced it moving forward. They encountered the ancients 3 days after arriving, or perhaps 3 centuries, or perhaps 3 seconds. Time was meaningless in that place. The ancients were not creatures in any sense that humans could recognize. They were more like patterns, vast, intelligent patterns woven into the very fabric of existence. They had evolved beyond physical form so long ago that they no longer remembered what it felt like to have bodies. These beings had been waiting. Amy said this carefully because she knew how far-fetched it sounded. The ancients had observed the galaxy for billions of years and had seen countless young species emerge, grow, and reach the stars. Most of those species eventually self-destructed. Some were destroyed by others. A few managed to transcend their origins and join the ancients in their eternal existence. Humanity had caught their attention. The ancients saw something in humans that they hadn't seen in millions of years. A spark of potential that shone brighter than any they had known since the dawn of the current universe. They decided to give humanity a gift, a terrible, wonderful, and dangerous gift that would either elevate them to greatness or destroy them completely. Dr. Kevin Walsh was tasked with explaining. At that time, he had been the ship's medical officer, and now he was much more. He stood before the assembled leaders and raised his hand. Without touching anything, he reached out and grasped the molecules of a nearby steel table. The metal squeaked as it twisted and transformed into a perfect replica of a human heart, complete with chambers, valves, and microscopic details that should have been invisible to the naked eye. Kevin explained that this was the smallest of the gifts, the ability to see and manipulate matter at its most fundamental level. Every atom was simply energy, vibrating at specific frequencies. And once you understood those frequencies, you could transform anything into anything else. Lead into gold, stone into water, air into solid walls. The possibilities were limitless, but there were also darker gifts. Chief Warrant Officer Grace Sullivan stepped forward, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop. She had been an engineer before the transformation, a practical woman who repaired broken machines and kept systems running. Now she carried in her mind weapons that made nuclear arsenals look like toys. Grace projected images directly into the minds of everyone present. She showed them what the ancients had given her: reality warpers capable of dissolving the bonds that united matter across light years, time disruptors capable of rewinding time and erasing enemies from existence even before they were born, weapons of conscience that could end wars simply by rewriting the thoughts and memories of enemy populations until they forgot they ever wanted to fight. Several world leaders vomited, others wept. Some simply stared blankly as their minds tried to process the implications of what they were seeing. Secretary General Maria Santos was the first to find her voice. He demanded to know why. Why would beings of such incomprehensible power deliver such terrible weapons to a species as young and foolish as humanity? What could they possibly hope to gain? Captain Nathan Cross answered him. He had remained silent throughout the presentation, but now he spoke with a gravity that silenced everyone in the room. The ancients had explained everything to him during his time beyond the rift. The galaxy was not the peaceful place humanity imagined. Ancient empires ruled vast stretches of space with an iron fist. Mechanical intelligences expanded relentlessly, consuming everything in their path. The ancient races jealously guarded their territories and crushed any young species that might one day threaten their dominion. Humanity had been lucky until then. Earth existed in a quiet, secluded region that the great powers had not yet bothered to conquer. But that luck would not last forever. The ancients had seen the timelines. They had witnessed the possible futures that branched out from this moment in history. In most of those futures, humanity would be enslaved or exterminated within the next 100 years. The gifts were meant to change that, not to turn humanity into conquerors, but to turn it into a survivor, to give it the tools it needed to defend its home, and its people from threats it couldn't yet imagine. Admiral Cole Patterson posed the obvious question. How did they know that so much power could be entrusted to the crew? How did they know that these 37 transformed humans wouldn't seize control of Earth and rule like gods? Cross smiled sadly at the question. He explained that the gifts came with safeguards. The ancients had built limitations into the abilities they had bestowed upon them. The weapons could only be used for defense. They could not be used to conquer, oppress, or enslave. Any attempt to misuse the gifts would result in their immediate and permanent revocation. Moreover, the crew had changed in deeper ways. They remained human, but they were also connected to one another and to something greater than themselves. They felt the pain of others as their own. They could not inflict suffering without experiencing it themselves. The ancients had made them guardians, not warriors, protectors, not conquerors. Laura Bennett watched from the back of the room as the debates began. Some wanted to destroy the crew and the ship and pretend none of this had happened. Others wanted to study the gifts and find ways to replicate them for all of humanity. Some suggested locking the survivors away forever, where they could never use their terrible powers. He looked at Captain Cross and saw exhaustion in his eyes. He had carried this burden across the void between realities. He had accepted responsibilities no human should ever have to bear. And now she had to convince her own people that she was still one of them. Laura made another decision then. She would defend the crew of the Horizon's Edge. She would help them reintegrate into human society. She would be the bridge between what they had become and what humanity still was. Because if the threats Cross described were real, Earth would need every advantage it could get. And these 37 transformed humans might be the only thing standing between humanity and extinction. The news broke 3 weeks after Horizon's Edge returned, and humanity reacted exactly as Laura Bennett had feared. Half the world celebrated the crew as heroes and saviors, while the other half demanded their immediate execution. Protests erupted in every major city. Religious leaders declared the crew either blessed by divine providence or corrupted by demonic forces. Scientists endlessly debated whether the gifts were genuine technology or elaborate forgeries designed to destabilize the global order. The United Earth Council met in emergency session every day for 2 weeks straight. Laura attended every meeting as the official liaison with the survivors of Horizon's Edge, and watched with growing despair as humanity displayed all the petty divisions and tribal conflicts that had plagued it throughout its history. Even in the face of evidence of their cosmic insignificance, humans could not stop fighting amongst themselves. Secretary General Maria Santos led the faction demanding disarmament. She argued vehemently that humanity had proven time and again that they could not be entrusted with powerful weapons. Every advance in destructive capacity had been exploited. Spears led to swords, guns to guns, bombs to bombs, and finally to nuclear missiles. The pattern was clear and undeniable. Giving humanity access to reality-altering weapons would only hasten its inevitable self-destruction. Admiral Cole Patterson presented the opposing view with equal passion. He reminded the Council that Earth existed in a hostile universe filled with species that viewed humans as insects to be crushed or cattle to be harvested. The Velkuri Empire had already conquered 3 intelligent species in Earth's stellar neighborhood. The artificial intelligence known as the Synthesis had been expanding its territory for thousands of years and showed no signs of stopping. Humanity needed weapons capable of defending against such threats, or it would be swept away like dust in a storm. The survivors of the Horizon Edge watched these debates with growing frustration. They had tried to explain that the gifts weren't simply weapons that could be wielded or locked away. The abilities had become part of their identity. Asking them to give up their gifts was like asking them to give up their arms, their eyes, or their ability to think. It wasn't possible, even if they had wanted to. Laura spent her days interviewing the crew and her nights writing reports she knew no one in power would ever read. She learned their stories one by one. Amy Porter had been a brilliant physicist before the mission, with 3 children waiting for her back on Earth. Those children were now adults with their own families, and they didn't know how to relate to a mother who hadn't aged a single day in 17 years. Kevin Walsh had become engaged to a woman named Catherine before he left. Catherine had waited 5 years before finally accepting that he would never return. He had married someone else and built a life for himself, and now Kevin had to watch from afar as the woman he loved grew old with another man. Grace Sullivan had no family to return to. Her parents had died while she was beyond the level. Her younger brother had perished in a mining accident on Mars. He told Laura that the loneliness was the hardest part. His gifts granted him the power to reshape matter itself, but they couldn't bring back the people he had lost. Captain Nathan Cross bore the heaviest burden. He felt responsible for every member of his crew and every consequence of their transformation. He was the one who had ordered the Edge of the Horizon to investigate the anomaly. He was the one who accepted the gifts from the ancients on behalf of all humanity. If those decisions led to disaster, the blame would be his alone. Laura once asked him if he regretted anything. Cross was silent for a long time before answering. He said that regret was a luxury he couldn't afford. The ancients had shown him alternative futures. He had seen what would happen to Earth if they hadn't accepted the gifts. Slavery, extinction, unimaginable horrors inflicted on billions of innocent people. Compared to those results, even the worst possible use of their gifts was preferable. The breakthrough came 6 weeks after their return, when a faction of the Council proposed a deal. The crew could retain their abilities, but would be subject to strict supervision. A new organization called the Horizon Initiative would be created, its sole purpose being to monitor the survivors and ensure their powers were never misused. Laura was appointed to lead this organization despite her protests that she was unqualified for such a responsibility. The crew accepted the arrangement with weary relief. They didn't want to be seen as threats or weapons. They wanted to go home and rebuild what was left of their lives. They wanted to see their families, walk on the Earth, and remember what it felt like to be an ordinary person. But the universe wasn't finished with them yet. The first warning came 3 months after they reached the agreement. Grace Sullivan awoke screaming in the middle of the night, visions of fire and death filling her mind. The other survivors experienced similar nightmares. Something was coming, something the ancients had warned them about, something that would test whether humanity deserved to survive. Laura received official confirmation the next morning. Long-range sensors had detected a massive fleet gathering at the edge of the solar system. The energy signals matched records of Earth's limited contact with alien civilizations. The Velkuri Empire had finally detected humanity's presence and decided the upstart primates had become too dangerous to ignore. The ultimatum arrived via hyperspace communication 3 days later. Earth had 30 standard days to surrender unconditionally. All humans would be registered as property of the Empire and distributed among the Velkuri noble houses as servants and laborers. Any resistance would face total planetary annihilation. The debate in the council chamber ended instantly. There was no longer any doubt about whether to use the gifts. The only question was whether they would be enough. Captain Cross assembled his crew for the first time since his return. They formed a circle aboard the transformed Horizon's Edge, and for a moment, they ceased to be refugees, weapons, and political problems. They were simply 37 humans who had lived through hell together and somehow survived. Cross told them this was the moment the ancients had prepared them for. This was the test that would determine the future of humanity. She asked them if they were ready to fight for their home, their people, and their right to exist in a universe that wanted them dead. They all said yes. Laura watched from the observation deck as the horizon rose and joined Earth's pathetically small defense fleet. 47 human ships against an empire that had conquered countless worlds. The odds were impossible. The outcome was certain. And yet he felt something strange as he watched the transformed ship take its place at the head of the formation. He felt hope, because those 37 people had touched something beyond human understanding and had returned transformed, yet unharmed. They had been granted the power to reshape reality itself, and they had chosen to use it in defense of their species. Whatever happened next, humanity would not surrender. They would fight with all their might. And if the gifts of the ancients were real, then perhaps impossible odds meant nothing. The Valkyrie armada emerged from hyperspace like a swarm of metallic locusts that obscured the stars. 800 capital ships, each large enough to house a small city. 50,000 support ships, from troop transports to fighters and automated weapons platforms. The fleet's combined firepower could reduce Earth to molten slag in less than an hour, and everyone on both sides knew it. Admiral Cole Patterson, standing on the bridge of the flagship Unity, watched the tactical display with a resigned expression. His fleet consisted of 47 combat-ready ships, crewed by men and women who had never faced an enemy like this. Most were going to die. He had accepted that reality days ago. But the horizon loomed over the center of the formation, and her presence changed everything. Patterson had seen what the crew could do during training exercises. He had seen Grace Sullivan disintegrate a target drone with just her thoughts. He had witnessed Kevin Walsh reshape the hull of a damaged ship as if it were made of clay. He had felt Captain Cross penetrate his mind and show him visions of possible futures that branched out from that moment like the roots of a tree. Supreme Commander Valkyrie sent one last message before the battle began. It was from an ancient creature called Lord Catherine, who had personally overseen the extinction of 2 intelligent species during his long career. His scaly face filled the communication screens of every human ship, and his voice dripped with contempt as he offered Earth one last chance to surrender. Captain Cross answered on behalf of humanity. He spoke calmly and clearly, and his words were broadcast to every human on Earth and to every soldier in the Navy. He declared that humanity would not surrender. He declared that Earth would not bow to conquerors who regarded other species as property to possess and discard. He said the Valkyrie had made a mistake coming here and that they wouldn't get another chance to correct it. Lord Catherine laughed. It was a horrible sound, like bones grinding. He said countless species had boasted the same thing before being reduced to dust under the Empire's yoke. He said humans would make excellent slaves once their spirits were properly broken. He gave the order to attack. The first wave of Valkyrie fighters took off from their carriers and headed toward the human fleet in perfect formation. There were thousands of them, and each one carried weapons powerful enough to destroy a human warship with a single shot. The Unity's tactical officers began announcing solutions for the target, and Patterson prepared to give the order to fire. Then Grace Sullivan stepped forward. She stood alone on the observation platform at the edge of the horizon, her eyes closed and her hands raised. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the first wave of Valkyrie fighters simply ceased to exist. One moment they were there, the next they were gone. No explosions, no debris. They had been erased from reality as completely as words wiped off a blackboard. Lord Catherine's confidence wavered for the first time. He ordered his capital ships to open fire with their main batteries. Beams of concentrated energy ripped through space toward the human fleet, with enough destructive power to split planets in two. Kevin Walsh raised his hand, and the beams veered away from their targets. The energy that should have destroyed human spacecraft was diverted into empty space and dissipated without causing harm. He had simply convinced the fundamental forces of the universe that the weapon's fire should be directed elsewhere. The Valkyrie commanders panicked. They had never encountered anything like this. Their weapons were useless. Their fighters were being cut down by the hundreds. The tactical situation that had seemed so overwhelmingly in their favor was collapsing around them. Lord Catherine ordered an all-out assault. The 800 capital ships advanced with their weapons in rapid succession. If subtle attacks failed, they would simply overwhelm the human defenders with their sheer numbers and firepower. No amount of unusual abilities could stem such a massive wave of destruction. Captain Cross finally revealed the full extent of what the ancients had given them. He extended his consciousness and touched every human ship in the fleet. He connected the minds of each crew member with one another and with the transformed survivors on the horizon. For an eternal instant, they ceased to be separate individuals, becoming a single, unified intelligence with one purpose and one will. The human fleet moved as one. Ships that should have collided danced around each other in perfect harmony. Gunfire that should have missed struck critical systems with impossible precision. The fleet of human ships transformed into something greater than itself, something that struggled with the coordination of a single organism. Amy Porter reached across the network and touched the reactors that powered the Valkyrie ships. She understood energy in ways a junior Valkyrie engineer could only grasp. She whispered to those reactors and they heard her. Across the Navy, engines began to fail. Weapon systems lost power. Life support flickered and died. The battle Lord Catherine had expected to last for hours ended in minutes. Human ships sailed through the chaos untouched, while Valkyrie vessels drifted helplessly, their systems disabled and crews terrified. The once mighty armada that had conquered countless worlds was now a collection of floating tombs. Lord Catherine's flagship was the last to fall. Grace Sullivan reached out and touched the ship with her mind. He didn't destroy it. Destruction was too swift and merciful for a creature that had orchestrated the extinction of entire species. Instead, he simply disabled the weapons and engines and left the ship adrift in space. Lord Catherine would have plenty of time to contemplate his defeat before rescue arrived. The human fleet assembled on the horizon as the full extent of their victory became clear. They had faced the greatest military force in the known galaxy, and they had won. Not through numerical or technological superiority, but through gifts that transcended anything the Valkyrie had ever known. Admiral Patterson contacted Captain Cross with a single question. "And now what?" Cross was silent for a long moment before answering. He said this was only the beginning. The Valkyrie would return sooner or later. Other empires would take note of what had happened. The synthesis would add humanity to its list of threats to eliminate. Earth had announced its presence to the galaxy in the most dramatic way possible, and there was no turning back. But they had also demonstrated something important. Humanity was no longer a species that could be conquered or ignored. Now they had allies, protectors who had received the power to defend them from any threat. The ancients had chosen well in selecting these 37 humans to bear their gifts. Patterson asked what the crew planned to do next. Cross said they would rest for now. They would return to Earth, see their families, and try to remember what it felt like to be an ordinary person. But they would also prepare, because this victory was only the first battle in a war that would last for generations and determine whether humanity had a future among the stars. The horizon turned toward Earth, and the crew felt the familiar pull of home. They had been gone for so long. They had changed in ways they were still trying to understand, but they were still human, and Earth was still their world, and they would defend it against whatever adversity the universe might throw at them. Behind them, the shattered remains of the Valkyrie armada floated in the darkness, a warning to anyone who would consider threatening humanity again. The message was simple and clear. We are not prey. We are not slaves. We are humanity, and we are only just beginning. A year had passed since Saul's battle, and humanity was still trying to grasp the meaning of his victory. The Valkyrie Empire had withdrawn from 3 star systems in response to its devastating defeat. Other spacefaring civilizations sent diplomatic emissaries to Earth for the first time in history. The species that had once been considered primitive primates was suddenly treated with respect and even fear. Laura Bennett was in her office at Horizon Initiative headquarters, reviewing the latest intelligence reports. The galaxy was watching humanity closely. Some saw them as potential allies against common enemies. Others saw them as a threat that had to be eliminated before they became too powerful. Some ancient civilizations simply watched with curiosity, wondering if this young species would be worthy of the gifts bestowed upon them. Captain Nathan Cross visited them that morning with the news they had been waiting for months. The crew of the Horizon's Edge had made a decision. They could not remain on Earth forever. The ancients had given them gifts meant to be shared, and standing idly by while the universe burned around them felt like a betrayal of that purpose. Laura asked where they planned to go. Cross explained that there were other species out there facing the same threats that had nearly destroyed humanity. Young civilizations crushed by ancient empires. peaceful worlds consumed by artificial intelligences, intelligent beings crying out for help that never came. The crew had the power to respond to those cries. She wanted to argue with him. She wanted to tell him that Earth still needed them and that they couldn't just abandon their homeworld. But she looked into his eyes and saw something that choked her words. He wasn't abandoning anything. She was fulfilling the purpose entrusted to her, despite the heartbreak. In truth, the ancients hadn't chosen these 37 humans to be guardians of a single planet. They had chosen them to be guardians of something much greater. The farewell ceremony was held at the orbital station where the horizon had first been sighted a year ago. World leaders gathered alongside ordinary citizens to watch the ship that had saved humanity prepare for its final voyage. The crystalline formations of its hull pulsed with a soft blue light, as if bidding farewell to the world that had witnessed the birth of its crew. Amy Porter held her children one last time. They were adults now, with lives and families of their own, but they were still her bobbies. She told them she would always love them. No matter how far she traveled, she told them she was proud of the people they had become. She told them to look after one another and never forget that the universe was full of wonders waiting to be discovered. Kevin Walsh was alone at the observation window, watching the Earth slowly rotate beneath him. Catherine had come to see him off, and they had talked for hours about the years they had lost and the futures that could never be. She was happy now with her husband, her children, and her quiet life. He was happy for her even. Although a part of him always wondered what might have been, he whispered goodbye to the life he could have lived and turned toward the life he had been given. Grace Sullivan had no family to say goodbye to, but she still found herself surrounded by people, engineers and technicians who had worked with her during the past year. Scientists who had studied her abilities with awe and curiosity, soldiers who had fought alongside her in battle. She thought she was alone in the universe, but she was wrong. Family wasn't just about blood. It was about the bonds you built with those around you. Captain Cross addressed the assembled crowd one last time. He thanked humanity for accepting them back. After all those years lost beyond the stars, he thanked the leaders who had chosen to trust them instead of fearing them. He thanked every person who had shown kindness to his crew during their time on Earth. He promised that, no matter how far they traveled, they would never forget where they came from. Then he made a second promise. The horizon would return someday. When humanity was ready for the next step in its journey among the stars, the crew would return to guide it. The ancients had shown him visions of humanity's potential. He had seen futures where humans spread throughout the galaxy, bringing hope and wonder to worlds that had known only darkness. He had envisioned futures where humanity merged with the ancients, transcending physical form to become patterns of pure consciousness, woven into the fabric of reality. These futures were possible, but not guaranteed. Humanity would have to earn them through centuries of growth, struggle, and transformation. The gifts bestowed upon the crew were merely the first step. The rest of the journey belonged to everyone else. Laura watched from the control room as the horizon ignited its engines. The ship began to glow with the same blue light that marked its crystalline formations. Space itself seemed to curve around the vessel as it prepared to travel to places no human had ever reached. She thought about everything that had happened since that night when she first detected the phantom signal on her radar. She had been an ordinary officer with an ordinary job. Now she was the leader of an organization dedicated to protecting humanity's place among the stars. The universe had transformed her with the same intensity as the crew at the horizon, only in different ways. The ship folded space back on itself and vanished. One moment she was there, and the next she was simply gone. The crowd stood silent, stunned, for a long time before slowly dispersing. Life would go on. The Earth would keep turning. Humanity would keep growing, changing, and reaching horizons it could not yet see. Laura remained by the window long after everyone had left. She gazed at the stars and wondered which one would grace the horizon at that moment. She wondered what worlds they would save and what species they would protect. She wondered if she would live long enough to see them return. Then she smiled because, despite everything that had happened and everything that was yet to come, she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time: hope. A pure, simple, and utterly irrational hope for a future that seemed impossibly bright. Humanity had been tested and found nothing to disappoint. It had inherited immeasurable gifts and unimaginable responsibilities. It had proven that it deserved to exist among the stars. And somewhere out there, among the infinite possibilities of creation, 37 humans who had touched the divine were carrying humanity's message to the farthest reaches of the universe. We are here. We rise, and we are not afraid. The stars seemed to shine a little brighter as Laura finally turned away from the window. She had work to do, reports to write, meetings to attend, an entire world to prepare for the challenges ahead. The edge of the horizon had shown them what was possible. Now it was up to the rest of humanity to make those possibilities a reality. She returned to her office with a determined stride and a fire in her heart. The story of the edge of the horizon had ended, but the story of humanity among the stars was just beginning, and she intended to make sure it was a story worth telling.